While I've complained about many things during this series, usually DC's laziness and artistic bankruptcy, I've never accused DC of not being thorough in its pursuit of those questionable values. Seemingly not content with a prequel book for every member of the Watchmen and Hollis Mason, DC's Before Watchmen also includes several smaller tie-ins so as to better besmirch the more intimate and niche areas of Watchmen's legacy. Here are my thoughts on that extra material. Moloch, the B-grade magician-type villain to whom the comedian confesses and Adrian ultimately murders in the original Watchmen. Who would have thought that Moloch would have an interesting story to tell? Well, certainly not J. Michael Straczynski, who returns once again from his work on Dr. Manhattan and Night Owl for these two issues of pure boredom. The first of these focuses upon Moloch's upbringing in a vaguely identifiable rural American township where the superstitious locals and children alienate Moloch for his hideous appearance. When a circus comes to town, it's not long before Moloch's newfound fascination with illusion leads him to take revenge on his peers and flee into a life of criminal mysticism, culminating in a clash with the superheroes of the day and eventually Moloch's Christian salvation. In the second issue, Moloch finds himself unwittingly recruited by Ozymandias as part of the plan to distract Dr. Manhattan. Gloriously, we're treated to Moloch running errands of all kinds, delivering irradiated packages to Janie Slater, and performing the mind-numbing task of cross-checking equations Adrian has deliberately altered. A task which is only slightly more interesting than reading a comic book about a man cross-checking said equations. But perhaps Moloch's worst sin is that Straczynski has again failed to respect any semblance of continuity. It was my understanding that these books were a prequel to the original graphic novel, but here Adrian describes his plan to use Manhattan's teleportation energies to create a false flag attack, which would appear to be a reference to Adrian's plan from the Zack Snyder film version of the story, not the squid attack we see him planning in his own tie-in. But the worst criminal here remains the book's art, drawn by Eduardo Riso, which to my eye just lacks sophistication. I'm not sure if the line work is at fault or if the colouring is the culprit, but the result is bland and quite ugly. Certainly the colouring gives the book a very flat appearance, which creates scale problems, some pages appearing to contain characters of vastly different sizes. The truly hideous backgrounds seem to have been created with Adobe's gradient tool, and many pages waste large amounts of space for no discernible reason. In the end, Moloch did make me sympathize with the marauding magician, but mainly because he was forced to appear in such a dreadful comic book. The Curse of the Crimson Corsair. Do you remember Watchmen's in-universe comic book, The Tales of the Black Freighter, being read by the young boy at the newsstand? It was one of Watchmen's many clever inventions and skillfully interwoven with the main plot so that it ultimately had a very satisfying payoff by the story's end. Not one to leave any stone unturned, Before Watchmen, taking the most reductive reading of the Black Freighter story possible, includes a pirate story of its own, Len Wein's The Curse of the Crimson Corsair, a couple of pages of which appear in almost every issue of Before Watchmen. Now, weaving a cohesive tale throughout that many disparate stories might sound like an impressive achievement. That is, until you realize that The Curse of the Crimson Corsair is not an in-universe comic book at all, but just a backup story divided into 30, count 'em, individual chapters, each of which begin with the declaration that it is a new chapter before concluding on the very next page. Though DC now has the story online for free, and I would not recommend reading it, originally this format mandated the purchase of 30 of the 37 total issues if you wanted to read it in full. But if Curse succeeds at one thing, it is the complete misapprehension of the function served by the Black Freighter story from the original, which was crucially a comic book and not an actual account of events in universe. This mattered because the world of Watchmen is one in which superheroes are not the subject of idle fantasy, but in fact real people, which in turn meant that comic books could not depict heroes the same way. But Curse is not written by Max Shea or any other fictional comic book author, it's written by Len Wein, and this suggests that these events are themselves part of the history of Watchmen's world. Furthermore, Curse completely fails to ask any questions relevant to a larger story which might have justified its inclusion. Of course, this points to a larger flaw of Before Watchmen itself, which contains no overarching thesis or ideas, or even basic stylistic continuity. It would have been difficult for Curse to be related to the stories to which it is attached, but even surely knowing this, DC stuck it on anyway, and the result is the very worst this event has to offer. A lazy, cynical inclusion, ugly to look at, painful to read, boring, tiresome, utterly irrelevant to, and in fact the antithesis of the story it is aping. And having forced myself through the entire saga, I can say that it contains a twist so insultingly obvious that you would immediately dismiss it if you hypothesized on the story's probable direction. Utter garbage. Dollar Bill, or as I shall remember it, the moment DC became a parody of itself. This is exactly the sort of comic book you would write if you were trying to demonstrate that you did not understand the themes of Watchmen at all. The plot of this book. A young William Benjamin Brady loses his dream of becoming a professional footballer to injury and decides to take up acting, eventually being offered the role of Dollar Bill because he is the only person willing to wear the ridiculous outfit. He then discovers that he likes being a superhero only to be killed when his cape is comically caught in a door. Yeah, I wish there was a charitable interpretation I could offer for this book's existence, but there just isn't one. There was plenty of other material to exploit, which DC did. They managed to milk this event for 36 other issues, and yet somehow, they still could not resist commissioning a comic book about Dollar Bill, a character so forgettable that a concerted effort is required even to hold him in one's memory. My central gripe with Dollar Bill is that, death aside, what we have here is effectively a classic Golden Age comic book, the type of thing Watchmen rebelled against in the first place. Len Wein, back again, has subverted a subversion, and in so doing removed anything that made the Watchmen universe interesting. Here we have a character free of irony or ulterior motivations, rewarded mostly for the conditions of his birth and upbringing, and the result is an unbridled celebration of the American value system. It is truly baffling that this was published. Even if the themes themselves weren't problematic, it's not much of a testament to the story here when it was still delivered better in a single sentence by Rorschach in Watchmen #1. Steve Rude's art certainly has some skill behind it, it's just unfortunate that Wein decided to cover so much of it in heavy-handed dialogue and narration, which only completes the Golden Age illusion. Ultimately, I lack the vocabulary required to tell you just how facile this one-shot really is. All the same, I would implore you not to read it.